Well, good morning, VOD View and VOD TV viewers. Today we're welcoming and we have the privilege of having our friend Matt Polka with us. Matt, welcome to the show.
Ken, always great to be here with you. Thanks very much for having me again.
Well, last week I saw you quite a bit, but unfortunately it wasn't in real life, but it was like real life. It was the Independent show, and you had a great show in a virtual kind of reimagined way. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things, specifically maybe some of the comments from Ron Brownstein and Commissioner Rosenworcel. But first, before we do that, let's get your impressions of the show.
Well, all of us at ACA Connects, we're so pleased to work with our good friends at NCTC, Rich Fickle, my pal, who we've done so many of these shows now. We've actually done 10 shows together. So it was great to be there with the members, and it's great to be there supporting them in a virtual world. But I think in many of the same ways that we do in person to provide great content to our members that really covers the gamut of business operations, leadership from a great CEO panel that we had recorded with 11 of our leaders, as well as the policy aspects of our work. So we really covered a lot of ground over 2 days, and I know our members appreciate it. We were very glad to produce this forum.
Yeah, one of the things you spoke of the CEO panel that I thought worked really well was the fact that you could bring in more of your members than you would in a normal stage where you couldn't have 11 people on stage.
Yeah, and we had more content than we could use, actually. We recorded each one of the 11 leaders that joined us for at least a half hour, and then tried to put that into basically a 30-minute session. So there's a lot of good content that we didn't get to that we hope to cover on our website afterwards for our members to be able to hear the complete interviews. But it does go to the point that a virtual event gives you greater flexibility to be able to include more voices. And that's what I think we did. To have 11 of our leaders in a session like that, when typically we might have 2 or 3, really helped to give our members a lot of the perspective, from the the C-level, so to speak, in terms of where where their companies should be moving forward and how they should be thinking about planning here in somewhat of a post-COVID world. So we were very, very happy to produce that panel for our members.
Now, about some of the feedback you received from Ron Brownstein, and he made some provocative comments. One of them I kind of wrote down because it's scary in many ways. His belief that the closest time parallel to today's world is the 1850s, and we all know how that ended. One of the comments he made on that was he claims that the transcontinental railroad could not be built. And that made me think of a broadband. I did a little fact checking on that. I'm not certain that was really 100% of the reason it couldn't be built, but it's still, I'm sure it did play into the North-South and so forth, and not wanting to have an advantage, one side having an advantage. A long preamble into the question of, what were your thoughts on that comment?
Well,
and how it relates to broadband.
I understand what he was saying, because I think his point was, we live in such a divided world. Could we come together to find common ground to be able to build something that would be so beneficial to the country, like the Transcontinental Railroad was? Well, I think the truth is that we already have, in terms of building broadband networks across our country. There is certainly bipartisan commitment and agreement, for us all, whether we're in industry from a commercial perspective or in government, sort of overseeing it, to want to provide broadband to all. And I think we've done that. I mean, over the last 10, 20 years, when you look at the literal billions of dollars that have been invested by private industry to build these networks, that's quite a commitment. I mean, our members alone, just in the last few years, have invested more than $10 billion because of a lighter touch of regulation that have allowed them to reach, the far corners of remote and rural America. And I think that commitment exists, whether conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, House, Senate, majority, minority, particularly now in light of the COVID crisis, because of how important broadband was to meeting the needs of all Americans, who went home for work, school, etc. And that commitment remains. What also remains is and maybe are those gaps, those broadband gaps that still need to be filled. whether it's more for telehealth, more for schools, more for students, more for low-income families, more for actual unserved areas, where we at ACA Connects would love to see more of a public partnership, where private industry continues to pour in the investment through that lighter touch of regulation that has allowed them to meet 90+% of the need, but for government to focus on those gaps through very specific funding programs, et cetera. Our fear, because of the division of our country politically, and maybe this goes back to Ron's comment, our fear from an ACA Connects perspective is that if there is a change in this year's election, a movement toward the Democrats at the FCC, et cetera, that could reignite the whole debate over net neutrality, which we think would be counterproductive to what we've just witnessed, where business and commercial interests have really put the investment in to meet the bulk of the need, and now working together with the government, we can fill the gaps that are needed through government specific efforts. So that's our hope, but hopefully we can rise above political divisions when it comes to it, and focus on better mapping, better identification of who needs broadband, and how we can work together to actually make sure that they get it.
Well, and he spoke of this whole thing of the whipsawing back and forth on regulation, and it seemed like certainty was part of the important thing that I heard from your members as well.
That's entirely true. What Ron said. We've seen this. When you look at when you look at how things changed between the last two chairmen, when you look at the impact on financial markets, willingness of funding sources to invest in our members to obtain financing for broadband under Chairman Wheeler, when he imposed Title II net neutrality, the possibility of rate regulation, the funding for investment dried up. And that was before even the harsher aspects of Title II were implemented. The funding sources said, well, look, if there's no certainty that you can recover your costs, I'm not going to lend money to internet service providers. And that's what our members demonstrated. Contrast that to when Chairman Pai came in and basically repealed those portions of Title II and the potential of rate regulation. Because of that certainty, funding opened up, which allowed for the greater expansion of broadband networks, which I would argue met the need here in this COVID crisis, because of the ability that our members over the last 4 years had to invest and innovate and deploy to actually meet this crisis before we even knew there was going to be one. So, to me, that's the template that works. That investment, our members, through investment and through deployment of broadband, have every incentive to serve everybody they possibly can. But this is a big country, and there are going to be aspects and places where we can't economically and under commercial principles. That's where private industry can and should work with government to solve those unique gaps and to fill those unique gaps.
Well, and back to the kind of the policy thing, one of the things he recommended was finding common ground and create forums where people could come together to find that common ground. It seems like that's something ACA does real well, but it seems like it probably resonated with your comments.
I hope so. I think ultimately we do need to find common ground. Yes, we live in a divided world, but I mean, how are we going to solve problems unless we are willing to take the time to listen to each other, to perhaps listen to views and opinions that we may not share, but realize that we're all kind of in this in many ways together to try to solve these problems. I mean, that's what we try to do at ACA Connects, because in our history over the last nearly 30 years, we as smaller providers have said, gee whiz, we're not big enough to influence one side or the other. We need to work with and talk with anybody who's willing to talk with us, whether that's Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, House, Senate, majority, minority. It doesn't matter. I mean, we want to find common ground, and we actually want to demonstrate the way we think not only our members and our association should act in this very divided political environment, but also maybe how we should act as citizens too. to be able to talk about things in grown-up ways, even if we don't agree, but to try to find common ground. So hopefully, through what we do in our efforts, as well as more in general, we can maybe find that common ground going forward, despite what happens in the upcoming elections. That's our goal.
And that's a great goal. I mean, one area of common ground, it seems like, is 5G is the hype in Washington D.C. We heard it a little bit from your representative Doyle, even going as far as suggesting that the government needs to provide funding for Open RAN. And I was thinking, that triggered a comment that Tom Williams, the CTO of Schurz, made in his comments about not picking favorites. And it just seems like there's so much hype around 5G. And I want to get your thoughts on it and how it relates to rural areas and the other areas your members.
My views on 5G in general really haven't changed. Look, new technology is around us, whether it's 5G, whether it's satellite delivered through low Earth orbit satellites, satellite broadband, fixed wireless, etc. And that's good. The more people that can be served, the better. And this goes kind of to my point of filling the gaps. If there are things that we can do to promote other technologies that may be better to filling some of the broadband gaps than maybe a wired broadband connection, I think that's fine. And we, have no problem at all with, those sources helping to meet that need. But 5G in our marketplaces where our members serve in general is probably going to be less of a factor, simply because of just the technical aspects of delivering 5G, the heavy investment that it takes, the need for antennas in various close proximity. That's a lot of infrastructure to serve what could be just a few people in rural America, and so 5G is not economically a good bet or a good idea, economically feasibly in our areas. But in the more urban markets, suburban markets, sure, I think that'll be a factor. But this is something that most technology from a communications perspective has been worked out through the commercial markets, and because of investment and innovation and then deployment to make economic sense. So I'm sure 5G will meet a great need and provide a great opportunity in many markets. In many ways, our members will be part of that, because in some markets they'll be providing the backbone. I mean, 5G isn't just wireless, but you have to have a wired connection to be able to provide the 5G. And in many places that's going to be our members helping to work to help develop and deploy 5G. So at least on the backhaul side of things. So it's just another technology. I think our members are prepared for it. They know that at the end of the day, right now there's nothing that beats in that wired connection. Many of our markets are 1G and up, and we have talk of our members now providing up to 10G. So they're ready and prepared for the future.
Well, it's funny. About a week ago, I talked to the CTO of Innovation Lab that's owned by the city of Peachtree Corners, Georgia, a little suburb of Atlanta. Actually, it's the headquarters where Scientific Atlanta headquarters used to be.
Sure.
But they've got an innovation zone, and one of the things that was touted was 5G. But as we were talking, he said, "Well, yeah, the fiber actually is Hargray, and it's we need the fiber. The 5G needs fiber, right? And it's a fiber backbone through this innovation zone they have."
There you go. Perfect example of how our members are actually, ironically, going to be, helping to make 5G a reality. But that's because of fiber, and that's because of high-speed, wired internet.
One of the other things that Representative Doyle mentioned was that private industry needs to step up, and clearly, with the connectivity pledge they have. But I noticed that you guys, ACA Connects, and this might be fodder for a future interview, but you have this new thing, the K-12 Bridge to Broadband program.
Sure, and we're not the only one. Other associations have participated as well. NCTA, USTA. And TCA, organizations are already partnering with the K-12 initiative. I think it's just another way to help students, and schools connect. And basically what this partnership allows our members to do is to work with Education Superhighway, which is one of the sources behind K-12, to connect us, our members, with schools, school districts, and students to find ways through this program and its specifics, to help create opportunities where we can expand broadband not only into the school, but to identified students who need to have a broadband connection. Our members have been doing it a lot throughout the pandemic, but this is really a more organized way. And we were, very, very glad to introduce the program to our members a week or so ago in a webinar. We already have close to a dozen, even more so, of our members that are signed on, in addition to what they're doing, and we'll be reaching out to others. So, it's just one more way that our members are demonstrating their commitment to meeting the broadband need in their communities, and I think this initiative will help to do it.
Well, the homework gap is something that's near and dear to FCC Commissioner Rosenworcel's, her heart. And one of the things that it was Patty is just she's terrific. She did the terrific interview with Commissioner, and I did not know that Patty played the trombone. I guess she was the first female trombone player.
Yeah, I think so. And Poplar Bluff
High School. Commissioner Rosenworcel had a couple of good sound bites. One being, we went from an analog to a digital United States, one fell swoop. And then another one was no child left offline. She asked a couple of provocative questions like, what if we expanded the existing E-rate program to loan out devices? And, in my thinking, that's kind of creating this virtual school tethered by this broadband connection. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with her. When she talks about, and she has been talking about this since the start of the pandemic, hashtag homework gap. I think she's right. We have to work very hard as internet service providers in our communities to identify, those students that aren't connected. And I think she points out correctly too that it's not just a question of deployment, because in many cases where students aren't connected, it's not that broadband's not going by their house. They just haven't adopted it for economic reasons, or because they can't afford the connection or they can't afford the equipment. And this to me comes back to exactly what I was saying as a perfect example of public and private cooperation on how to recognize and then solve these things. When I talk about solving the gaps, we really are talking about E-rate. We're talking about low-income broadband plans. We're talking about telehealth. We're talking about funds that are directed to unserved areas that don't have broadband, where government funds can be used directly to subsidize students, low-income families, hospitals, providers to build in unserved areas to actually, meet that specific need. Because frankly, you've got private industry doing the lion's share, 90 plus, almost 100%. But there's that small gap. I mean, I can think of even, when our country sought to electrify itself through the Rural Electrification Administration, started in 1936. With the goal of making sure that every American had electricity. By 1960, 24 years later, some 5 million people were still not connected because of how remote, they were. And so that's what I mean, that it takes specific federal resources to help meet those specific needs. We'll get you 98% of the way through commercial and private investment, but we need to work with the government to help solve it. So, I think programs that help to close that homework gap are important. In the meantime, you see what our members have done, working directly with schools, investing in schools, coming up with joint ventures with schools, launching throughout their community, free hotspots, where students could engage, and to do so more often. So we're finding ways to meet this need until we can ensure everybody has the equipment they need, and they're connected to a broadband connection.
Yeah, and I suppose it probably at the local level too, it probably, with school boards and even educators, is to think of the school beyond the physical boundaries of the school too. It's kind of a new way of thinking, maybe.
Well, nowadays, Commissioner Rosenworcel is exactly right. I mean, all of the technology that we're using today, just like this interview, existed before the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, we're now forced to use it. But by the same token, we're learning, how effective it is to be able to communicate this way, and how much more effective we can be for many reasons. And so she's absolutely right that we now have to embrace this new digital world, which we're in whether we like it or not now, and do the best we can. It does focus on broadband as an essential element of the delivery of that communications. And it is essential. That doesn't mean, from our perspective, that it should be treated like a utility, because we think that would actually have a reverse effect on more deployment and filling these gaps. But it is essential, and everybody agrees that it's essential, and we ought to treat it as such.
So from a mapping perspective, I mean, that's the challenge, is finding out where those last few people are, relatively speaking. And she was very critical of that, the mapping data. She claimed that the error rate could be as much as 2 in 5 in some cases. And she was critical of the idea of giving out so much of, I guess it would be CAF funding prior to having better data. It seems like this has been an issue for a decade now. Any thoughts on that and how it can be resolved?
We definitely need better mapping, and in fact, in the next month, I think we'll see the FCC vote on items that will encourage better mapping. And I certainly agree with her, as do other commissioners, that we have to get away from what is now mapping that's just not granular enough. We have been taking steps toward better mapping, but when you can say, all right, there's one broadband connection in a census block, so that means the entire census block is served. Well, that's usually not true.
Right.
And there are a lot of unserved people. So the maps need to get granular. They need to be geolocated, where we can focus down on individual homes and whether they're served. It's a complicated system. We're definitely moving in that direction, but I think it also underscores that, like I said before, this is a big country, and it takes a lot to physically map it all. We're getting there, and I think the commitment by both Democrats and Republicans are there to do it, certainly at the FCC and also in Congress as well. So we're supportive of much more granularity. You have to always balance that with what's the right approach that doesn't become too burdensome from a standpoint of requirements and regulations on smaller businesses. We don't want anything to hamper the service in general,
right?
But let's find a way to get better maps, and I think that'll help everybody in the long run.
Yeah, it seems like the challenge of the decade, or it has been for the decade. So
yeah, exactly.
Not an easy problem, I don't think, to solve. So moving forward, the summit's going virtual next year.
We are. We haven't announced the date yet, but we'll be providing and producing a virtual summit similar to what we just saw last week with the Independent Show in spring of 2021. And the reason we're doing this is because Washington really probably will not likely be back to normal by then in the spring.
Wait. Does that mean it was normal at one point?
Well, you said it.
Laughter. Yeah.
You said it, I didn't. So we don't expect that our members will be able to visit their congressmen and senators and staffs, because the House and Senate office buildings will still be under protection, so to speak, from a lockdown perspective because of the virus. But we're excited to do and to provide a virtual summit, which again gives us greater flexibility. So we expect to do 2, if not 3 days of speakers, panelists, policy, Capitol Hill, FCC, keynotes, our industry speakers, doing much more for them, so that we can provide a lot of content to our members, but also a lot of the things about communications and grassroots and ways that they can better connect as well. So we're looking forward to doing that with our members sometime in the spring, and we'll also be lobbying virtually as well.
Well, I look forward to seeing that. Of course, it's not the same as being in person, but you guys, like I said, did a great job on taking, make lemonade out of it, as Dale Carnegie would say last week with the Independence Show. So I congratulate you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks we're looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thanks again for your time.